Okay, so their misconceptions according to Vedic culture basically, well, let me say this first before I mention that, because it will steer me in the direction of the point that I really want to make, is that this misconception is basically reinforced by our lack of critical thinking. And lack of critical thinking not only in regards to our conceptions, but lack of critical thinking in regards to the implications of some of our conceptions. And this lack of critical thinking, of course, reinforces the ignorance, which is actually the root cause of our problem. Does it make sense so far, what I'm saying? So then, there's misconception, and misconception is reinforced by lack of critical thinking. Of course, the modern age doesn't make it easy to be a critical thinker. Of course, you're all in university, so I guess you're somewhat considered critical thinkers, right? Either critical thinkers or people with really good memories. Anyway, that wasn't meant to be like a diss or anything. So this lack of critical thinking comes up where people are so much distracted that there isn't even the time to think critically about too many things in life, like our conceptions. So anyway, so misconceptions basically have three categories. There are many, but they broadly can be divided into three categories. A misconception about the self, a misconception about the world that we live in, and a misconception about the source of both. Does it make sense? There's basically three categories of misconceptions. What's the first one? Second one? And the source of both. Whether that source is impersonal or personal. In other words, is there a God or is there not a God? Is it an impersonal source or a personal source? The Vedas identify these as the three broad categories in which we have misconceptions. I'll not go into a deep discussion of all of them because there's some time, but I would like to examine the first one, which is our self-conception. Our self-conception is practically the most important thing that we need to operate in this world. In fact, you have to have some sort of self-conception just to get dressed in the morning, isn't it? Just like, for example, why does a girl put on a dress instead of, okay, let me explain it. No, why does a guy put on jeans instead of a dress? Generally speaking. Generally, this is a general notion. I mean, there are varieties, and I'm not going to get into that now. That's okay also. But as a general notion, I see a lot of guys that here, and many are wearing pants and shirt. How come none of the guys wear dresses here? Anyone wants to speak? How come you don't have dresses on?
Culture. We don't own any.
You don't own any? Okay, you don't own any dresses? Suppose you have one really nice Cinderella type dress. Would you wear it to this program?
I don't think it would fit in these chairs.
So obviously he wouldn't wear it. I think that's because the conception doesn't allow you to do so, in fact, generally. I have a self-conception of myself that isn't compatible with wearing a dress, for example. So self-conception is important in even doing minor things in our life, like getting dressed. Self-conception forms a major part. And self-conception also forms a major part of how we establish relationship with each other and with the world that we live in. For example, suppose there's a beautiful girl or man in a Cinderella dress, even though it doesn't fit whoever said that, probably. So he's sitting there, and three types of persons are looking at him. One person is a lion. He is actually a person. We're not going to go into that point right now. Another is a very lusty man. And another person is a saintly, sage-like person. So do they see the same thing? No. What does a lion see when he sees a beautiful woman? Food, dinner. That is if he's hungry. If he's not hungry, he'll probably be peaceful. Usually animals don't attack unprovoked. But if he's hungry, he sees dinner. What does a lusty man see? Okay, we have to pass that one. It's a little bit radar. And then what does the sage or saintly person see? Anyway, I guess many of us may not be sages, so we can't exactly say. But we say he sees something different, right? So although they all are looking at the same object, they see something different because of their self-conception, right? So the self-conception will determine the way they establish the relationship with that beautiful woman in Cinderella dress. Does that make sense? So the self-conception is so important for doing simple things like getting dressed. It's important in establishing relationship with others in the world that we live in. And the self-conception also becomes the basis for which we set our criteria, our goals, and the actions to achieve those goals. So someone thinks, I am a scientist, or what's his goal as a scientist? Any scientists there? I'm sure we might help you.
Does engineering count?
I guess.
They tell us it doesn't.
Oh, really? Sorry. But it counts for me because I don't know anything. So, what is your goal as an engineer?
Mostly to make sure everything works.
No sleep. Okay. So someone has a conception as a student. What is your goal with that particular sort of conceptual orientation? Get out as soon as possible. Okay. So in this way, these are two simple examples. In this way, our self-conception also determines our goals, and therefore the actions that we will take to achieve those goals. So if there's a misconception about who we are, then everything is actually defeated by that one misconception, right? Does that make sense? It's just like saying 2 + 2 = 5 in the beginning of some very complicated formula. And everything you do after that is not correct or misdirected. So the Vedic culture says that the basic ignorance that faces souls in this world is that we have a misconception that we are this material body. So this in other words, that I am this vehicle that you see before you. The analogy can also be given as the difference between a driver of the car and the car itself. So when the driver thinks himself the car, what do you call that? This is not a rocket, huh? I mean, it's not a trick question. If you're driving your car, you think, I am this car. I am this BMW 2010. Then what do you call that person? Generally speaking. If someone told you, walked into this room and said, I am my BMW, then what would you say to that? Delusional? They say, well, we have some psychiatrists on campus, and I think you need to take a little visit over there, right? So if you think you're something that you're not, you're generally called as crazy, right? And dealing with crazy people can be very complicated, at least so I hear. So then basically the Vedas say that we also suffer from a type of insanity because the conscious entity thinks himself this body. The basic premise is that consciousness is actually different from matter. And so when consciousness identifies with matter, then it starts to work only for the basis of that misidentification and not for the actual person. So if you thought you were a car, you spend all your energy working for the welfare of the car, but then the actual person suffers. Does that make sense? So also, we think that we are these material bodies, and so we spend all our energy trying to keep the bodies nice and trying to establish relationships with one another on the basis of that bodily conception. But because that actually fails to address the actual person, we still live a life where most persons end up feeling dissatisfied, particularly the midlife situation comes up where people feel confused about who they actually are. And in this way, life becomes a life of despondency or one of sorrow, especially in the old age. So then it becomes the source, this misidentification becomes the source of all sorts of isms. You have racism, sexism, so many isms are there. How many of us are a fan of these isms? But these isms are due to the body conception of life. It's like, suppose I think I'm a BMW and you're a Toyota Corolla. Toyota Corolla? Yeah, sorry, it's a little bit of a tongue twister for me. So then I say, the Toyota Corolla comes driving over my way, I say, this section is only for the BMWs. Then, of course it's a type of arrogance, but it's an arrogance based on thinking myself the car, right? So similarly, we have this sort of arrogance that comes up because of thinking ourselves the body. So my body is different from your body, so this section is reserved for persons with this type of body, or with this type of psychology, and that section is for persons of that type of body. So then you have these isms that come up. Now, although the bodies are so different from each other, there's a oneness on the basis of humanity, right? We see that although the variety of the cars are there, we share a oneness because in all the cars there are human drivers, right? And they all probably have basic set of same sorts of desires. So the Vedic culture says, although we have so many different types of bodies, and we have psychologies that also follow these types of bodies, there's a oneness on the basis of consciousness, that we're all conscious entities. And our reason to say that as conscious entities, we kind of have reached for the same thing. We want to be happy, isn't it? In a general sort of way, we want to be happy. Everyone here is seeking happiness. Now that's a premise. Is that a safe premise to make? Everyone here is seeking happiness? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So everyone of us is seeking happiness both directly and indirectly. Directly, we want to come in contact with some pleasing situation. And indirectly, we seek happiness by trying to avoid some negative situation. Now this is true for all conscious entities, even those in lower cars, like cockroaches. Anyone here ever seen a cockroach before? Okay. So cockroaches. Now what happens to a cockroach when you try to step on it. I mean, we don't recommend that as far as the Vedic culture that you step on cockroaches or even kill them necessarily with raid. But suppose you know, at least before we were a little bit more enlightened, we see a cockroach running on the ground and you try to step on it, what does the cockroach do? It moves pretty fast too, right? Sometimes it's a little frustrating when you're trying to snatch it. So you see that he's kind of exhibits something that we would also exhibit on a conscious subjective level. If someone was trying to kill us, we move, we try to get out of the situation. So although the bodies look so variegated from the lower life forms all the way up to the human species that we're aware of, we exhibit a oneness on the platform of consciousness. And as conscious entities, we search for the same sorts of things. But then the problem comes up when these conscious entities think themselves these bodies, and then they try to establish a culture on the basis of that bodily conception. Such a culture, the implications of such a conception is that it's very exclusive. Whereas the implications of a spiritual conception, where we're all conscious entities, we share oneness on the level of consciousness, is that you're intrinsically included, because we're already coming from the divine or from the Supreme Lord himself. Krishna in the case of the Bhagavad Gita. Does it make sense? So in other words, my opening segment was, you may be wondering, how am I a black guy but a Hindu monk? But the idea in Vedic culture is that there's no question of someone becoming a Hindu or becoming even a Muslim or anything like that. Everyone is already intrinsically included because we're already sharing a oneness with one another on the platform of consciousness, coming from the same source. So such a conceptual orientation to reality inherently engenders a culture of compassion, a culture of tolerance, because your car doesn't have to look like my car. It doesn't have to be like my car in order for you to be included. You're already intrinsically included on the level of consciousness. And therefore, you're naturally compassionate towards other entities. You're naturally tolerant of their shortcomings and so on, as we are also having our own. And that way, the culture becomes one based on upliftment of the conscious entity from such degrading misconceptions. Does that make sense? So this actually becomes the basis of the culture, if you will, or spiritual culture, Vedic culture. Primarily, it's the understanding. We have the conceptual orientation that consciousness is different from matter. On that level, we share a oneness, we share an inclusion with everyone on that platform. And then everything we do in the culture is meant for helping us realize that substantially. Because it generally takes more than just a conceptual orientation to be convinced of it. It takes a process of really realizing it substantially. Just like sometimes, for example, I'll share this with you. Please don't find fault with me, but I didn't really like white people when I was young. Because when part of my training, Chandris, please don't tell my mother this. She's one person who's friends with my mother. But part of my training as a child, my mother used to say, she was kind of like, you know, black power and reparations and, you know, like that. I remember being 7 years old, being taken to a Malcolm X movie and Black Panthers and, you know, like this sort of thing. And I kind of caught the idea in one African movie that white people were like demons, you know. Anyway, don't mind. I was a child, so I'm granted a little bit of ignorance there. So then, the worst thing happened to me when I went to the 5th grade. I was transferred to a predominantly all-white school. So you can imagine with the conceptual orientation that I was having, what that did to me as a 10-year-old kid. I was, oh my God, I'm in a room of demons. Of course, because I'm a child, I was very young, and children usually tend to interact with each other very easily. So I ended up making some white friends, and I said, oh, they're kind of like human beings too. And they're kind of nice too. And then all my friends ended up being white in high school and so on. So my point is that although we heard so many things in school about how racism is bad, and that wasn't exactly enough for me in the beginning to overcome that sort of conceptual orientation. Of course I needed interaction at the time. My point is that although we have this conceptual orientation, that we're not this body, that's the conceptual orientation that the Vedas work with. But to realize that substantially, by which you actually, in your subjective being, will actually be inclusive, compassionate, tolerant, is much easier said than done. And so in order to help us accomplish that, the culture, spiritual culture of the Vedas, actually allowed that, or had a program where everyone's life was intrinsically connected to achieving that realization. And that way you had a culture that was spiritually progressive together. Now the modern culture has a totally different basis, one that says we are this body, and where the whole thrust is to try to enjoy this material world more effectively. So that leads to so many problems, and if you want to know what type of problems, you can just go to CNN. But the spiritual implication of the idea that we're actually consciousness at the most fundamental level, and that matter is that we can actually get along easily. And we actually support each other towards a spiritual end. So like I said, I can only cover that one little aspect of the culture. So whatever you're seeing, the dancing, even the food that you will have later on, the drama that you will see after this and so on, all of these ideas were intrinsically to help give support to us in the realization of ourselves being different from matter. And that way you have a spiritually compassionate, progressive culture that's very nice for everyone, including the cockroaches. So that's my little talk. I hope you were able to understand and tolerate. I think I got my point across as effectively as I could in the short time that I was given. Is that okay? Is it okay? So if anyone wants to ask a couple of questions before we go to the next act, we're open to take a couple of questions. Just to kind of maybe nuance some of these elements, which I...
Another question. What happens if, like, you're working in the spiritual conception that, I'm a spirit soul, but then you come across somebody who doesn't have that spiritual conception, and it might create a conflict?
Well, he could. It's just like the cockroach. I imagine he doesn't have a spiritual conception of himself. Of course, I can't say that for sure because I'm not in a cockroach body. But at least according to the Vedas, the consciousness in those types of bodies is not as evolved as the consciousness in a human body. That doesn't mean that the consciousness in a cockroach body is less. It's just like we had a Toyota Corolla in the temple that I live in now, that if you were to floor it, it would go from 0 to 40 miles per hour in like 10 minutes. If you floored it. Right? So obviously that type of vehicle wasn't as effective as, let's say, a Mercedes-Benz 2014 that can go from 0 to 80 in like 2 seconds. So the human form of life is identified in the Vedic culture as one where this type of critical thinking is really made more possible. It is not as possible in those lower life forms. It doesn't make the consciousness less, but it does make his facility less for being for being a critical thinker. So my point is that the cockroach probably doesn't have a critical way of thinking of himself. Rather, he's just concerned about eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. These are the basic four divisions of thinking for all species, including uncritical human beings. And therefore, how do we treat that cockroach when we come across him with the spiritual orientation that we have? The first thing we think is not step on it. The first thing that a person would think is how it could be facilitated. Now, of course, facilitating a cockroach's ascent to spiritual realization is a daunting task. But it could be facilitated in a simple way by giving, let's say, food that is offered to God, which is a very prominent sort of idea in the Vedic culture. And in that way, the point still remains, it becomes a culture of tolerance, inclusion, compassion, non-judgment, and so on. Just like the cockroach may be undeveloped, so also the consciousness in many human forms may also be undeveloped. And therefore, they have very negative or ignorant ways of thinking about life. For example, God can hate people. Is maybe a prominent conception of certain individuals. And that leads to a certain sort of problem in so many parts of the world, just that one little conception. So a person with a, let's say, more evolved consciousness would not exactly judge him per se for being, let's say, less involved in his way of thinking about things. He would rather just try to address the root cause of the problem, which is ignorance. So he still becomes tolerant and compassionate, et cetera, all the other goodies that I mentioned in my little discussion. Does that make sense? Are there any other questions from other guests? Or? Yeah, you can just speak loudly.
How do I go from hearing you say that I'm not my body to believing it all the time?
Yeah, so that's what I was saying. To say it and to capture with our intellect is much easier than actually realizing what that means and living it. So Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, all you know the Bhagavad Gita? Bhagavad Gita is a very important book, famous book. Einstein read it. So many famous people have read it. Thoreau, Emerson, Gandhi, it was his favorite book. He used to read it every day. This is just a tangential point, but I just wanted to bring it in here.